"Stay still," he whispered, voice low but firm, his hand sliding carefully down my ribs, checking for injury, but stopping just a little too long, just a little too low. My heart wasn't racing from the crash anymore. It was the look in his eyes, the quiet, charged moment where the lines blurred and the air felt too thick to breathe. Something passed between us in that breath, something that had nothing to do with sirens or pain. The first time I saw him, I was strapped to a stretcher on the side of a dimly lit road, half dazed from the shock, headlights still burning into the night behind me. A rear-end collision, nothing dramatic on paper, but enough to leave me dizzy and short of breath. Unsure if it was the impact or the way he looked at me when he leaned in to adjust the straps. I wasn't expecting someone like him, tall, steady hands, quiet eyes, a deep voice that didn't need to say much to be felt. His name was Drew. He introduced himself as he knelt beside me, hands moving with practiced calm, checking vitals and murmuring instructions that sounded more like reassurances than orders. "You're okay," he'd said, his hand firm on my shoulder, grounding me as the ambulance lights painted red over his cheekbones. "I need you to breathe slowly. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Can you do that for me?" I nodded, lips dry, heart thudding for reasons that had nothing to do with the accident. There was something in the way he focused on me, not just medically, but personally, like I wasn't just another call in a long shift. Like I mattered. Hey, if you're here and feeling the vibe already, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe to support these stories and help more people find them. It means the world, and it keeps us going. Thanks for being here. In the back of the ambulance, he stayed beside me even after the other medic climbed up front. The doors shut, the engine rumbled, and we were alone in a moving box of steel and light. He checked my ribs again, lifting the hem of my shirt gently, his fingers brushing along my side, pausing at the place where I flinched. "Tender here?" he asked, but his eyes flicked briefly to mine, the corners softening just a little. I nodded again, though the sting in my chest had dulled beneath the weight of his touch. His hands were warm, careful, my breathing calmed, not because of any instruction, but because he was close. So close I could see the slight stubble along his jaw, the way his lashes cast shadows down his cheek each time he looked away. He pressed the gauze gently against a scrape on my arm, then taped it down with slow precision, like he had nowhere else to be. "You'll probably be sore for a few days," he said, voice still low, eyes not leaving mine. "But you'll be okay." Something about the way he said it made me want to believe him, made me want to see him again, somewhere that didn't smell like antiseptic and rubber gloves. As the ambulance slowed and the hospital came into view through the narrow window behind him, he reached to adjust the strap across my chest again. But his hand lingered, just slightly, just long enough that my breath caught. He noticed. I saw it in the flicker of his eyes, the split second of hesitation, and then his voice, still calm, still firm, softened further. "Stay still," he said, but his hand slid lower. The emergency room was bright, sterile, and crowded, but all I could think about was him, Drew. The paramedic who had looked at me like I wasn't just another incident logged on a clipboard. Nurses checked my vitals, asked the usual questions, but my mind wandered again and again to the way his hand had lingered, the way his voice lowered, like we shared something that didn't belong in that ambulance, something quieter and more dangerous. After some routine scans and a few hours of monitoring, the doctor told me I was fine. Just bruised. Sore ribs, a few scrapes, nothing serious. They handed me my discharge papers and a prescription for painkillers, and that should have been the end of it. Except as I made my way toward the exit, still a little unsteady, I saw him, leaning against the ambulance bay wall, sipping a coffee, his uniform slightly wrinkled, eyes scanning the parking lot like he was waiting for something. For me. I hesitated at the sliding doors, wondering if I was reading too much into things, if maybe I'd imagined the way his fingers had lingered, the weight in his gaze. But then he saw me, and his whole posture changed. He pushed off the wall slowly, coffee abandoned, walking toward me with a kind of careful certainty that made the rest of the world fall away. "Hey," he said, soft and almost unsure, "you made it out in one piece." "Barely," I replied, managing a small smile despite the butterflies in my stomach. "I guess I owe you a thank you." He shrugged, but the corner of his mouth lifted. "Just doing my job." "Right," I said, eyes dropping to the concrete before flicking back up. "Still?" "You stayed." His jaw tightened slightly, as if he wasn't sure whether to acknowledge it. Then quietly, "Yeah, I did." There was a pause, too long to be casual, too loaded to ignore, before he finally asked, "You need a ride?" I raised an eyebrow. "Is that also part of the job?" "No," he said, stepping closer, his voice lowering like it had in the ambulance. "That's personal." The ride to my apartment was quiet, but not awkward. Tension simmered in the silence, thick with the weight of everything we hadn't said out loud. I kept stealing glances at him as he drove, one hand on the wheel, the other resting loosely in his lap, his forearm flexing slightly every time he shifted gears. His eyes flicked toward me at a stoplight, catching me mid-look. "You good?" he asked, half smiling, half testing. "I don't know yet," I said. "Are we going to talk about it?" His gaze sharpened, jaw tensing for a second. "About what?" "The way you touched me," I said, more direct than I expected. "The way you looked at me." He didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled the car over to the curb outside my building and put it in park. Then he turned to face me fully. "I wasn't supposed to," he admitted. "And I shouldn't have. But I couldn't help it." I swallowed hard, the tension between us growing heavier with every breath. "So what now?" He looked down at his hands, then back at me. "Now I walk you upstairs. And if I've got it all wrong, you tell me to leave." The choice hung in the air between us. I nodded slowly. "Okay." He opened his door, circled the car, and walked me up without another word, but his hand brushed the small of my back as we reached the top step. Barely a touch, but deliberate, grounded, real. When we reached my door, I turned to him. "You want to come in?" His answer was in the way he looked at me, intense, focused, just like he had on the side of the road. "Yeah," he said, "I do." The second the door clicked shut behind us, everything changed. What had been tension simmering quietly all night suddenly became too much to hold back. Drew stepped forward slowly, like he was giving me time to stop him. But I didn't want to stop anything. I met him halfway, and when his hands found my waist, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "You sure?" he asked softly, voice low and close to my ear, his breath warming the side of my neck, sending a shiver through me I couldn't hide. I nodded without hesitation, resting my forehead lightly against his. "I've been sure since you told me to stay still," I whispered, smiling slightly. "But you didn't." He chuckled, quiet, rough, and a little breathless as his fingers slipped under the hem of my shirt again, this time without needing an excuse. "That was the moment I knew I was screwed," he murmured, kissing the side of my jaw, "because I didn't want to stop touching you." He backed me up slowly toward the couch, never rushing, his eyes on mine with every step. When the backs of my knees hit the cushions, I dropped down and pulled him with me, his weight grounding me instantly, his hands exploring with a kind of reverence that made everything feel tender and electrifying all at once. His fingers skimmed along my ribs again, slower now, with more intention. I flinched, but not from pain. It was the memory of his touch in the ambulance, how I had felt then and how I felt now, letting him see me without any barriers between us. "You've got bruising here," he said, voice hoarse, lips brushing my collarbone. "I should be careful." "Too late for that," I teased, tugging his shirt up and over his head, tossing it aside. "You ruined me the second you looked at me like I was more than just a call." His hands stilled for a moment, his eyes softening. "You are," he said simply. "You are." The way he touched me next was slow, careful, like he was still half in paramedic mode, checking for tension, for comfort, for signals. But the other half of him, the part that wanted me, that part was pure heat. We kissed like we'd been waiting weeks, months, like we'd imagined it and had finally been given permission. His hands slid up under my shirt and then eased it off, exposing my chest to the cool air and his warm touch. Every brush of his fingertips, every soft kiss on my shoulder, felt like an exhale I'd been holding for too long. When he kissed lower, I gasped quietly, my hand finding the back of his neck, fingers threading into his hair. "Drew." "I know," he whispered, his voice muffled against my skin. "I know." The way he took his time made it feel like more than just attraction. It felt like something deliberate, something built from tension and trust, forged in the most unlikely place, a stretcher, a ride, a moment when everything else could have gone wrong but didn't. Later, when we were tangled together in a soft haze of heat and breath and skin, he pulled the blanket over us, his arm draped loosely around my chest. I rested against him, breathing in the clean scent of his skin, the faint trace of soap and fabric and something uniquely him. "I'm off tomorrow," he murmured sleepily, lips brushing my shoulder. "If you want me to stay?" I turned to look at him. "Do you?" "Yeah," he said, eyes heavy but open. "More than I expected. More than I probably should." I kissed him again, soft and slow, before whispering back, "Then stay." Morning sunlight crept softly through the blinds, striping the room in gold and shadow. I opened my eyes slowly, not sure for a moment where I was, until I felt the weight of Drew's arm across my stomach, his chest pressed to my back, his breathing warm against the curve of my neck. And then I remembered everything. The ambulance, the couch, his mouth on my skin, his voice whispering my name like it meant something. I stayed still for a moment, not wanting to break the spell. His hand moved slightly in his sleep, sliding along my waist, fingers brushing skin like it was muscle memory. I turned slowly, facing him, and found him already awake, eyes half-lidded but focused, calm and sure. "Morning," he said, voice rough with sleep but softened by something else. Affection. "Hey," I whispered, brushing hair from his forehead. "Still here." Didn't think about leaving, he said, his thumb tracing a line along my side, just above the bruise he'd noticed the night before. How are you feeling? I smiled at the question. Sore, but in the best possible way. He laughed softly, leaning in to kiss me, slow, lingering, not rushed. Not lust. Something steadier. It felt like the beginning of something real. As we lay there, quiet and warm, I let myself look at him fully. Not just as the guy who'd checked my vitals and strapped me to a stretcher, but as the man who touched me like I mattered, like he'd been waiting for that moment just as long as I had. There was a softness to him that hadn't shown up in the ambulance, a version of Drew that lived behind the uniform, and now I was seeing it up close. You didn't have to stay, I said finally, not as a challenge, but a truth. I know, he replied, brushing his nose against mine, but I wanted to. Last night wasn't just a heat-of-the-moment thing for me. I don't do this, ever, not on calls, not with people I meet on the job. I nodded slowly. So, what was last night? He exhaled through his nose, then said, maybe the start of something I don't want to lose. That hit harder than I expected. Not because I didn't want it to, but because I did. And maybe I had for longer than I realized. Before I could respond, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. He groaned softly, reaching for it, eyes scanning the screen with a frown. Dispatch, he muttered, then looked at me. They're short-staffed. They want me to come in. I wasn't even supposed to be on. You gonna go? He stared at the screen for another few seconds, then powered it off completely and set it face down. No, he said. Not today. I stared at him, surprised. You sure? He leaned in again, his lips brushing mine softly. Yeah. I think I've got someone else to take care of. And just like that, I felt everything inside me settle, calm and certain, like my own vital signs had finally found their rhythm. The day unfolded slowly, like it knew we needed the time. We didn't rush to get dressed or check the time. We moved around each other in the kitchen like we'd done it a dozen times before, brushing shoulders, exchanging quiet smiles, fingers trailing casually along backs and wrists, each touch familiar already. Drew pulled 2 mugs from the cabinet and handed me one, his thumb grazing mine just a second too long. It wasn't lust anymore, not completely. It was intimacy now, curiosity wrapped in warmth, the soft kind of wanting. Ever make breakfast for someone after a shift? I asked, half teasing, sliding eggs into a pan. He stood behind me, his hand lightly settling on my hip. Not unless you count drive-through after a 2 a.m. call, he said, his lips brushing close to my ear. But nothing like this. Not with someone I wanted to wake up next to. The honesty in that made my breath catch. I turned slightly to look at him, pan forgotten for a moment. This doesn't freak you out? It should, he admitted, fingers slowly smoothing down my side. But no, it doesn't. It feels easy. Right. We ate in the living room, plates in our laps, legs stretched out and tangled on the couch. At one point, he leaned over and kissed the corner of my mouth, without warning, then smiled at my stunned expression like he'd meant to disarm me on purpose. I've seen a lot, he said between bites. Car wrecks, house fires, overdoses, you name it. Some nights, it's all adrenaline and disaster. But last night, he set his plate down and turned toward me, all trace of teasing gone. Last night reminded me that not everything has to fall apart, that something good can still show up at the edge of a bad day. My heart ached a little at that, not because it hurt, but because it meant something, because he meant it. "And you think this is something good?" I asked quietly. He reached for my hand, intertwining our fingers. "I know it is." We didn't talk much after that, not because there wasn't more to say, but because being close, really close, was louder than words. He pulled me in, my head resting against his chest, his fingers tracing small, absent-minded shapes against the back of my neck. I could feel his heartbeat, steady and unguarded, and I matched my breath to it without even trying. We stayed like that until the sun began to dip, casting orange light across the floor. Eventually, I tilted my head up to look at him. "You going to disappear after this?" He met my eyes and shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "but I don't want this to be a one-night escape either. If it's going to be something, I want it to be real." "It already is," I whispered, "isn't it?" He kissed me again, longer this time, more certain, and that was answer enough. 2 days later, I was back at home, ribs still tender, bruises blooming softly along my side like shadows of a night that hadn't faded. I hadn't heard from Drew yet, and though he'd promised not to disappear, the silence gnawed quietly at the edges of my confidence. Maybe it had been more intense for me than for him. Maybe the job pulled him back too hard, and we'd just been a blip in each other's chaos. But then, just past noon, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize, until I saw the message that followed. "Hey, it's Drew. I've been thinking about you all day. How's the pain?" I smiled immediately, heart lifting faster than I wanted to admit. I typed back quickly. "Manageable. But the symptoms of withdrawal are setting in. Your hands might have been the best medicine." 3 dots blinked. "Then, that's an off-label use. Might need to see you in person for a proper follow-up." My fingers hovered over the screen for a second. Then I replied, "Doors open?" 15 minutes later, there was a knock, soft but unmistakable. I opened the door to find him standing there in jeans and a dark t-shirt, hair still damp like he'd just come from a shower, his bag slung across his shoulder. His eyes found mine instantly. "I told myself I'd play it cool," he said as he stepped inside, "but I couldn't stop thinking about you, about that night, about the way you looked at me in the ambulance like you saw past everything." "I did," I said quietly, "and I still do." The door closed behind him. He reached for my hand without asking, fingers closing gently around mine like it was the most natural thing. Then he leaned in, not rushed, not hungry like before, but slow, thoughtful, like he needed to memorize the way I tasted. Our mouths met in the stillness of the room, and when we finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against mine. "I don't just want this when you're hurting," he said softly. "I want to be around when you're okay too." "I want that," I said, voice barely above a whisper. "Not just as a patient." He smiled against my skin. "Number A's mine." Drew stayed the rest of that afternoon, and somehow the hours unfolded like we'd been doing this for months instead of days. There were no awkward pauses, no distance to close, just his hand resting lightly on my thigh as we talked about everything from his worst night on the job to my habit of sleeping with a fan on, even in winter. Every time I laughed, he looked at me like he'd discovered something rare. Every time he smiled, I felt it settle deeper in my chest. He didn't hover, didn't fuss like I was breakable, but I could still feel the part of him that was trained to care, to notice the way I shifted when my ribs ached, or the way I moved more slowly when I thought he wasn't looking. But now, his hands weren't touching me for medical reasons. They were touching me because he wanted to, because we both did. At some point, I stood to refill our glasses and winced just slightly, my shirt lifting a little too high as I reached. Drew was behind me in a second, not out of panic, but instinct. His arms wrapped around my waist, steady and warm. "You okay?" he murmured, his voice brushing against my neck. I leaned back into him. "Yeah, just sore." His hands slid under my shirt again, slow, confident, intimate, and this time it wasn't clinical. His palms moved up over my stomach, fingertips exploring gently like he was relearning my body now that it wasn't under fluorescent lights and protocol. I turned to face him, our chests brushing, our breaths sinking without effort. "Are you staying?" I asked softly, my hands resting on his sides. He nodded. "Unless you ask me to go." "I'm not going to." His lips found mine again, slower now, deeper, less urgency and more hunger. We kissed like we were writing something down to remember later, something we didn't want to fade overnight. He lifted my shirt carefully like it mattered, and I helped him out of his again, each of us moving with quiet purpose. No rush, no pretending. Back in the bedroom, we moved with the kind of care that doesn't come from nerves. It comes from want. His hands on my skin were slow and deliberate, like he was taking inventory of every response, every sound, every breath I gave him. My fingers explored the space between his shoulder blades, pulling him closer, holding him there. When it became real, we didn't speak. We didn't need to. Afterward, he curled behind me, one arm wrapped around my waist, his breath even against my shoulder. He kissed the spot just above the bruise, then rested his cheek there for a moment like it grounded him. "I wasn't looking for anything that night," he said quietly. "But the second I saw you, I knew I was going to break every rule I'd ever learned." I reached for his hand beneath the sheets and held it. "Then I'm glad you broke them." The next morning I woke up before Drew did, which felt strange, seeing him like that, quiet and still, stripped of the uniform and the urgency that usually came with it. His face was softer in sleep, lips slightly parted, lashes casting shadows across his cheek. He looked peaceful, human, mine. For a while I just lay there listening to the sound of his breathing, feeling the weight of his arms still draped across my waist like he hadn't moved all night. The room was warm, golden light stretching across the sheets, and I couldn't remember the last time I felt that kind of calm. Eventually he stirred, letting out a soft groan before his arm pulled me a little closer. "You're staring," he mumbled, voice still thick with sleep. "You caught me," I whispered, turning my head to look at him. He smiled, slow and genuine. "I like it." We lay there for another half hour, trading soft kisses and sleepy jokes, touching just to feel one another, light fingertips on bare skin, soft laughter muffled into shoulders. It felt like something sacred, like a space we'd both been missing for too long. But eventually the real world started creeping back in. Drew rolled over and checked his phone. A few missed calls, a message from dispatch, a long sigh. "You have to go," I said, already knowing the answer. He nodded slowly. "Yeah." can't dodge a double shift forever. I sat up, pulling the sheet around me. So this is where you walk out and disappear? He looked over quickly, eyes sharp and serious. Number, absolutely not. He stood, gathering his clothes, moving around the room with the kind of familiarity that said he didn't plan to be a stranger. When he slipped his shirt over his head, I couldn't help but smile. Half because of how good he looked in it, and half because I realized I wanted to see that sight again. Regularly. Before he left, he came over to where I sat at the edge of the bed and cupped my face in both hands, thumb brushing over my cheek. "I'll call you later," he said quietly. Not just a message, not just a maybe, a real call. "And if I don't answer?" I asked, half teasing. He smiled, then leaned in to kiss me. Slow, deep, certain. "I'll come back anyway." I walked him to the door, and when it closed behind him, the room didn't feel empty. It felt full of possibility, of memory, of a night that had started with a whisper and ended with something neither of us saw coming. And later that evening, when my phone finally lit up with his name, I didn't wait to answer. I pressed it to my ear and smiled before even saying a word. Because when someone touches you like that, with intention, with care, you remember. And when a paramedic tells you to stay still, sometimes what they really mean is, don't run from this. Not when it could be something real, not when it already is.